"I will have your baby," she said, and the rancher took her away. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Carter shaded his eyes against the late afternoon glare. The desert wind carried nothing but dust and the faint rasp of dry brush scraping against itself. For years, this land had spoken to him only in silence, the clatter of a windmill, the moan of a barn door left half open. Today, there was something else, a sound, weak, human. He tightened his grip on the Winchester and moved toward the dried creek bed. The sun had burned the channel into a scar of cracked earth. At first, he thought it a trick of the heat. Then a figure lurched out of the mesquite thickets, stumbling forward before collapsing hard onto the clay. Daniel raised the rifle to his shoulder. It was a woman, Apache by her dark braids, her bronze skin scorched raw by the sun. Her dress was torn, streaked with dried blood, her arms trembling as if every vein strained to keep her upright. She tried to lift her hands, palms out. Her lips cracked when she forced words through her parched throat.
"Do not shoot," her voice rasped. "I only want to live." Daniel's eyes narrowed. On her forearm was a deep bruise, the bone likely fractured. Her legs bore raw scrapes, her steps had been dragged more than walked. And yet her back remained straight, as if defiance alone kept her from falling apart. For a long moment he did not move. The rifle was steady in his hands. But in his mind, another image rose unbidden. His wife Sarah, in her final weeks, lying in bed with fever, her eyes burning with the same fragile fire. He had held a cup of water to her lips once, just like this stranger now, begging silently for life. Daniel's chest tightened. He exhaled slowly, lowered the barrel. From his belt, he unhooked a dented canteen, weighed down with the last of the well water, and tossed it onto the dirt in front of her. "Drink," he said, his voice gravel low. "Then come with me." The woman stared at him a heartbeat longer, as if to judge whether this was mercy or a trick. Then she seized the canteen with both hands, drank until every drop was gone, and let out a breath that was half sob, half relief. She nodded once. Daniel turned back toward the ranch. His boots sank into the dust with a steady rhythm, but his pulse quickened with each step. Behind him, the uneven crunch of her footsteps followed, hesitant, limping, but determined. For years, this land had carried only one heartbeat. Now, against his will, another had joined it. The woman followed at a distance, her gait uneven, one arm wrapped tightly against her ribs. Daniel did not look back. The sun was low now, spilling its fire across the mesa, painting the sky in shades of copper and blood. Shadows stretched long over the yard as he crossed the worn fence line of his ranch. She slowed when the cabin came into view. A weather-beaten house of pine boards, a sagging porch, and the wide pen where a few cattle grazed lazily. To her eyes, perhaps, it looked like a fortress. To Daniel, it was still an empty shell of a life that had once been full. He motioned toward the horse stable. There, shelter for the night. She hesitated, then slipped inside without a word. The wooden door creaked shut, leaving Daniel alone again on the porch. He leaned his rifle against the post and sank into the chair where he spent most evenings, watching the prairie darken. But the silence felt different now. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of another presence nearby, wary and unsettled. He could almost hear her breathing in the shadows of the stable. Daniel reached across the table beside him. A leather-bound Bible lay there, its cover cracked and softened by years of use. Sarah's Bible. He turned it open with rough fingers, not even sure why. His eyes fell on a verse he had read 1,000 times, but rarely out loud. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me."
Psalm 23:4. The words sank deep into him. For years he had lived as if abandoned, yet tonight they carried a weight he could not ignore. Perhaps it was because a stranger now shared this land, a woman just as broken, just as hunted by death's shadow. Inside the stable, Naya sat with her back against the wall, clutching a small bone-handled knife in her palm. The thin blade caught a faint glimmer of lantern light. Her dark eyes were wide open, watching every sound, every shadow, like an animal cornered. Daniel knew she did not sleep. He himself would not tonight.
When morning came, he stepped outside to the chill of dawn and found her already awake. She was drawing water from the well, her movements stiff but purposeful. She splashed her face, then, without being told, began clearing straw from the stable floor. Not for him, not for thanks, but simply because it needed doing. Daniel stood at the porch, arms crossed, watching. The prairie wind tugged at his coat. For the first time in years, he was not the only soul awake to greet the day on this land. He did not say a word, but he felt it deep in his chest. Something had shifted. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie, staining the horizon in pale rose and gold. Daniel Carter stepped out onto the porch, his boots creaking against the old pine boards. The air carried a crisp chill, and in the distance a coyote's call faded into silence. He expected, as always, to find his land still and empty at this hour. But the sound of the well crank turning broke that silence. Naya was already awake. Her movements were stiff, her limp visible, yet her arms pulled the rope with steady rhythm. She lifted the wooden bucket from the stone rim, her face damp with the cold splash of water she poured over her skin. No one had asked her to fetch it, no one had watched, and yet she did it as though this land were already partly hers. Daniel leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, observing. For years, he had been the only one to draw water before sunrise. To see another figure there unsettled him, yet he could not deny the quiet efficiency of her work. By mid-morning, the cattle stirred restless at the pen. One young calf found the weakness in a broken rail and darted out into the open field. Daniel cursed under his breath, reaching for the rope slung over the fence. But before he could move, Naya was already limping toward the runaway calf. Her steps were uneven, but she moved quickly, herding it with sharp claps of her hands and low shouts in Apache. The animal balked, skidded, then turned back toward the pen. She drove it along the fence line, her eyes blazing with focus. Daniel jogged after her, rope ready, but he slowed as he watched. She guided the calf with surprising precision, blocking its escape paths, forcing it toward the gate. Dust clung to her sweat-dampened hair as she cornered the animal, giving it no choice but to stumble back into the enclosure. With a grunt, she slammed the gate shut, securing the latch. For a long moment she stood there, chest heaving, her face streaked with dust. The sun glared down on her, but her gaze remained fierce, as if daring the world to test her again. Daniel stopped a few paces away. He had seen men falter at such work, even sound-bodied men. Yet this woman, wounded and limping, had moved with a willpower he could not ignore. He said nothing, only gave a small nod before turning back to the fence post, rope coiled in his hands. The rest of the day stretched ahead, but something had shifted. The ranch had been his burden alone for too long, a weight he bore in silence. Now, with every determined step she took across his land, that silence seemed less heavy. As he hammered a new stake into place, Daniel allowed himself one brief glance at Naya, who wiped the sweat from her brow and turned back to her work. He did not speak, but inwardly he acknowledged the truth. She was no longer just a stranger under his roof. By late morning, the prairie heat pressed down, shimmering over the fence lines. Daniel had set out with hammer and nails to mend a section of sagging rails along the western pasture. He expected to work alone, as he always did.
Yet when he turned, he found Naya already there, dragging a bundle of dry posts across the dirt with slow but steady strength. She said nothing, simply dropped the posts near the fence and picked up a hammer. Her limp made each step uneven, but her arms swung with a rhythm that spoke of practice. Daniel opened his mouth to tell her this was not her work, but the words never came. He simply watched as she braced a rail, lifted the hammer, and drove the first nail home with a sharp, ringing strike. The sound carried across the empty land, clear, certain, unhesitating. Daniel joined her, setting another post upright. Together they worked without words, the steady beat of iron against wood the only conversation between them. For years he had patched these fences alone, each strike echoing back against him, reminding him of silence. Now, with every swing she took, the silence seemed to split open. By noon, the sun bore down hard. Daniel moved to the barn to stack hay bales for the cattle. Heavy work, usually best done in the cooler hours, but the chores could not wait. He threw one bale onto the wagon and turned just in time to see Naya grasp another. She lifted with a grunt, her broad hands firm against the coarse twine, and heaved it onto the stack beside his. Sweat streaked down her temple, catching in the dust, but her movements did not falter. Bale after bale, she worked, her breath ragged yet determined. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, not from the labor, but from memory. He saw, for an instant, Sarah bending over their small garden years ago, sleeves rolled, face flushed with effort. She had been stubborn in the same way, refusing to be idle, even when fever first crept into her bones. He turned away quickly, forcing himself back to the rhythm of the work. The past could not be touched, no matter how vividly it rose before him. Still, the echo lingered. Watching Naya, he realized it was not only her strength that unsettled him. It was the refusal to yield. She bore her wounds as Sarah once bore her sickness, upright, unbroken, unwilling to ask for pity. The wagon filled, hay stacked high. Daniel wiped his brow, stealing one last glance. Naya stood beside the bales, dust clinging to her skin, chest rising and falling with exhaustion. Her eyes met his, dark and unflinching. He offered no praise, only nodded once, the same silent acknowledgment as before. She returned the nod, then turned back toward the barn without a word. Daniel remained where he was, hammer still in his hand. Something in the quiet exchange unsettled him more than the memory of fevered nights. This woman had stepped into his world without permission, and yet, with every task she took upon herself, the walls of his solitude cracked a little more. By evening, the air had thickened with heat, and the sky glowed in dull copper light. Daniel had just finished checking the northern fence when a faint cough reached him from the barn. He set his tools down and walked quickly toward the sound. Inside, he found Naya seated against the stable wall, knees drawn to her chest. Her forehead glistened with sweat, though the night was cooling, her shoulders trembling as though a chill ran through her bones. She did not look up when he approached. "You have a fever," Daniel muttered, kneeling beside her. Her eyes flicked toward him, guarded, ready to push him away. But she did not move as he lifted the hem of her skirt slightly to check the wound on her calf. The gash, once raw, now swelled red and angry, pus seeping through the cloth she had wrapped herself. Daniel's jaw tightened. Infection. Left alone, it would kill her. He stood, fetched a basin of water from the pump, a strip of clean linen, and his hunting knife. At the hearth, he heated the blade until it glowed dull red, then carried it back into the barn. Naya's eyes widened at the sight of it, but she made no sound. "Hold still," he said quietly. She gripped the edge of the haystack, knuckles whitening. Daniel knelt, pressed the hot knife against the wound, and with steady hands lanced the infection. The stench of rot filled the air. Naya's teeth clenched, her body rigid, but not a cry escaped her. He cleaned the wound with hot water, wrapped it in fresh cloth, and leaned back on his heels. Sweat rolled down her cheek, her breath ragged. Still, her gaze met his, defiant, unbroken. Daniel wiped his brow with the back of his hand. The image of Sarah returned with brutal clarity, her frail body in their bed, fever consuming her night after night, his helpless attempts to cool her skin with damp cloths. He had failed her then. He would not fail this woman now. As he tightened the bandage, a verse stirred in his memory, the same words Sarah had whispered when her strength was nearly gone. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. The words echoed through him as he looked at Naya, her body trembling from the strain. She was weary, more than he could fathom, burdened beyond measure. Yet she endured without complaint. Daniel rose, fetched a thick wool blanket, and draped it over her shoulders. "Rest," he said simply. "It's going to rain tonight." For a long moment she remained still, staring at the dirt floor. Then she nodded once, clutching the blanket around her. Daniel stepped back into the yard as the first drops began to fall, the scent of wet earth rising. He stood in the rain, rifle leaning against his shoulder, listening to the steady patter on the roof. Somewhere behind him, in the shadow of the stable, a stranger fought to live. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence break, not in sorrow, but in duty. The storm rolled in just after sundown, a low growl spreading across the prairie. Rain slashed against the tin roof, each drop ringing like a nail driven into the silence of the cabin. Daniel sat by the hearth, his rifle propped against the wall, staring into the fire. The orange light flickered across his face, casting shadows that seemed older than he was. The door creaked open. Naya stepped in, her blanket soaked, her hair plastered to her cheeks. She carried herself with the rigid posture of one prepared to be turned away. "Sit," Daniel said, nodding toward the hearth. He tossed another log onto the fire, sparks rising up the chimney. She lowered herself onto the floorboards, stretching her broad hands toward the flames. The scar on her cheekbone caught the light, a line carved deep by violence. For a long time, neither spoke. Only the storm filled the silence. Finally, her voice broke through, rough but steady. "I had a sister, younger. They took us both, tied with rope, marched for days, weeks. She did not survive." Naya's eyes stayed fixed on the fire, unblinking. "They hurt her. When I cut myself free, I left her body behind. Since then, the nights have been heavy." Daniel stared into the flames, the weight of her words pressing against his chest. He thought of the horse-drawn wagon that had carried Sarah and their boy away from this very ranch, fever already burning through them. He had ridden alongside, helpless, watching the sickness steal their laughter until only silence remained. "My wife," he said slowly, his voice gravel low, "and our son. Fever took them. This house used to hold their voices. Now it holds only the wind." The fire snapped, sparks leaping into the air. Neither sought to comfort the other. Words could not mend what had been broken. Yet, in that silence, something shifted. It was not the emptiness of two people alone in their grief. It was the stillness of two survivors who recognized the ruins in each other. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, and the rain poured harder, washing the dust from the earth. Inside, the cabin breathed with the sound of fire and storm, no longer cold, but sheltering. Naya leaned back against the wall, the firelight painting her face in gold and shadow. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, staring at the flames as though they might burn away the years. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like the last soul left on this land. The morning after the storm, the sky hung heavy and gray. Daniel walked the northern fence line, boots sinking into damp soil. The rain had washed the ground clean, leaving tracks sharp and fresh. He crouched, brushing his fingers over the prints. Horse tracks. 3, maybe 4 riders. The impressions were too deep for local ranch stock, too narrow for the government cavalry. Strangers. He straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. The open land stretched silent, but the unease settled into his bones. These men had come close, too close, before veering off. It was no accident. They were watching. Back at the yard, Naya carried a bucket of water, her dark eyes narrowing as she caught his grim expression. "What is it?" Daniel slung the Winchester from his shoulder. Riders, not locals. Her gaze sharpened. They will come back. He nodded once. Most men like that don't give up. For a long moment, he said nothing, only cleaned the mud from his boots on the porch rail. Then his voice came, slow and deliberate. "You should leave. If you move fast, you might lose their trail. They're after you, not me." Naya set the bucket down hard, the water sloshing over the rim. "I have been running long enough," she said, her voice low but fierce. She reached for the small knife strapped to her belt, checked the blade, then slid it back into its sheath. "If they want me, I will be waiting." Daniel studied her, jaw tight. Her stance was rigid, her eyes unshaken despite the shadow of threat. For years, he had believed solitude was safety, that by keeping his land empty, he kept it free of danger. Now he realized the danger had found him anyway. "You understand what this means?" he asked. "I do." The silence stretched, broken only by the drip of rain from the eaves. Finally, Daniel gave a short nod. "Then we get ready." The rest of the day was spent in hard, steady labor. Daniel boarded up windows with rough planks, reinforced the doors with iron brackets. Naya cleared dry straw away from the cabin walls to guard against fire, her hands raw from the work. She stacked wood into neat piles, every movement sharp and efficient. As the sun dipped low, they stood in the yard, sweat and mud streaking their skin. The ranch looked less like a homestead and more like a stronghold. Naya gripped her spear, planting its tip into the dirt beside her. Daniel rested his rifle across his lap as he settled onto the porch chair. They did not speak. But the silence was no longer distant. It was the silence of two people bracing for the same storm. The prairie wind rose, carrying the scent of scorched grass from somewhere far away. Daniel tightened his hold on the rifle stock. He knew, as surely as the riders knew, that blood would soon test this land. The following days bled together in hard labor. From dawn until dusk, the ranch became less a homestead than a fortress in the making. Daniel and Naya worked side by side, each task wordless but heavy with meaning. Together they drove in new fence posts, the hammer blows ringing like a drumbeat across the prairie. They hauled wood to the porch, stacked hay in tighter rows, and cleared brush that might hide approaching riders. Sweat darkened Daniel's shirt, dust clung to Naya's skin. Neither complained. Their silence was the language of survival. One afternoon, while pulling taut a line of barbed wire, the strand snapped loose and whipped across Daniel's hand. Blood welled quickly, dripping into the dirt. He cursed under his breath, shaking the sting away, but before he could tend to it, Naya stepped forward. "Let me see." Her voice carried no hesitation. She took his hand firmly, inspected the cut, then tore a strip from the hem of her dress. With slow, steady movements, she wrapped the cloth around his palm, knotting it tight. Her hands were rough, scarred, yet unexpectedly gentle. Daniel sat on a fence post, watching her work. The afternoon sun cut through the clouds, catching in her dark eyes. For a moment he saw not only the fierceness, but also the weariness she carried, the burden of a life lived under pursuit. "Thank you," he murmured. She said nothing, only released his hand and turned back to the work. But the warmth of her touch lingered long after. That evening, the cattle were herded into the pen beneath a sky painted in red dust and fading gold.
Daniel leaned against a fence post, breath heavy, while Naya lowered herself onto the porch steps, wiping grime from her cheek with the back of her hand. They sat apart, both exhausted, yet their gazes met in the twilight. When the chores were done, Daniel lit the fire inside the cabin. He poured a tin cup of coffee, carried it across the room, and placed it in her hands without a word. She took a sip, eyes never leaving his. The fire popped, shadows stretching long across the floorboards. The silence grew taut, filled with something unspoken. Daniel leaned back in his chair, unable to look away. Naya set the cup down, her fingers brushing the rim, then leaned forward slowly. The kiss came without force, without urgency, gentle, inevitable, like a truth they had both known but never spoken. For a moment, the storm outside their lives stilled. When they parted, Daniel gave a quiet nod, as though acknowledging an agreement long understood. Naya turned her face slightly, but the corner of her mouth lifted, the faintest smile he had seen since she arrived. That night, for the first time in years, Daniel slept deeply. The wind outside no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like a song. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The late afternoon sun burned low across the prairie, turning the dust into a haze of red light. Daniel Carter sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The land lay quiet, but not at peace. He had learned to read silence as well as any scripture, and this silence carried weight, the kind that pressed against a man's chest. Hoofbeats broke it. 3 riders came into view, silhouettes framed against the dying sun. They slowed near the gate, horses snorting, dust swirling around them in angry clouds. Their hats were pulled low, faces shadowed. But Daniel recognized the kind of men they were before a word left their mouths. Hard eyes, quick hands, and no use for law. The leader spat into the dirt. "We heard there's an Apache woman hiding out here." His voice carried the slow drawl of menace. "Hand her over, and you won't have any trouble." Daniel rose to his feet, the Winchester steady in his grip. "There's no one here but me." One of the men sneered, glancing toward the stable. "Then what's that shadow moving?" Behind him, Daniel heard the faint creak of wood. Naya stepped into the open, her figure half lit by the fading light. She stood tall despite her limp, her spear grounded firmly in the dirt. Old scars traced her shoulders, sharp reminders of battles survived. Her eyes did not waver. The leader chuckled. "That answers that. Last chance, old man. Hand her over." Daniel shifted his stance, his shadow stretching long across the yard. The barrel of the Winchester caught the sun, gleaming like tempered steel. His voice came low, iron in every word. "She stays. This is my land." The air thickened, every heartbeat echoing louder than the hoofbeats. The man's grin faltered into a sneer. One of his riders twitched toward his revolver, but the leader lifted a hand, holding him back. For a long moment, the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the leader spat again, turning his horse with a sharp jerk of the reins. "We'll be back, and when we come, you'll regret the choice you just made." The 3 riders wheeled away, galloping into the horizon, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of their threat behind. Daniel lowered his rifle, but did not relax. His gaze followed until the dust settled. Then he turned slightly toward Naya. She still stood firm, knuckles white against the shaft of her spear. "They won't stop," she said quietly. Daniel nodded, his voice steady though his chest tightened. "Then neither will we." The sun slipped below the mesa, casting the ranch into shadow. The line had been drawn.
There would be no turning back. The storm came without mercy, rolling over the plains with black clouds and fierce winds. Rain lashed against the cabin roof, seeping through the seams and drumming against the ground in a relentless rhythm. Daniel sat by the fire, rifle laid across the table, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. A sound cut through the storm, a door creaking open. He rose quickly, lantern in hand, and stepped onto the porch. In the dim light, he saw Naya moving through the rain, her blanket clutched around her shoulders, a small bundle tied across her back. She walked fast toward the fence, her figure bent against the storm. "Naya!" Daniel's voice thundered above the rain. She froze, shoulders tight. Slowly she turned, water streaming down her face like tears. "If I leave, they won't hurt you," she said, her voice carrying through the storm. "This land is yours. It should not be burned because of me." Daniel strode into the yard, boots sinking in the mud.
Rain soaked his shirt, plastered his hair to his forehead. "You think I'd stand here and let you vanish into the dark?" Her eyes flared with anger, though her voice trembled. "You owe me nothing. I brought this trouble." He stopped only a few feet away, lantern light trembling between them. His chest rose and fell, each word torn from him like a confession long buried. "I've already lost my wife and son, lost every reason I thought I had to keep this ranch standing. If you walk away now, I'll carry one more regret to my grave." Naya clutched the strap of her bundle, rain dripping from her fingers. The wind roared, whipping her blanket loose. Her lips parted, but no words came. Daniel's voice broke, raw and fierce. "I would rather lose this entire ranch than lose you." The words seemed to strike louder than the thunder. Naya stood motionless, the bundle slipping from her grip and falling into the mud with a soft thud. Slowly, she stepped toward him, her dark eyes burning even through the sheets of rain. Daniel reached for her shoulders, gripping them firmly, though his rifle still hung at his side.
"The Lord is our refuge and strength," he whispered, almost to himself, voice steady despite the storm. "An ever-present help in trouble." Psalm 46:1. Naya searched his face for any sign of weakness. There was none. Only conviction, born not of desperation, but of choice. The storm howled around them, but within that moment, something steadier took root. She let the blanket fall away, standing tall like a warrior ready for battle. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, lantern light leading them through the rain. The night no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a vow. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the prairie damp and heavy with silence. Low clouds clung to the horizon, the kind that made a man feel the world was holding its breath. Daniel Carter stood on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes sweeping the fence line. The riders would return. He knew it as surely as he knew the land beneath his boots. Naya stepped out from the stable, spear across her back, hair tied tight against the wind. Her jaw was set, her eyes sharp. She carried no bundle this time, no thought of leaving. She had chosen to stand. "Windows first," Daniel said, nodding toward the cabin.
Together they worked. Daniel sawed rough boards while Naya held them steadied, her hands firm despite the bandage still tight around her calf. The hammer strikes rang sharp across the yard, each one sealing another crack of vulnerability. From there, they moved to the barn. Naya dragged straw bales away from the walls, stacking them safely at a distance to keep fire from spreading. Daniel hauled sandbags, lining them along the porch as a barricade. The work was grueling, but neither complained. When Daniel paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, he glanced at her. Mud streaked her arms, dust clung to her skin, but her movements were swift, unyielding. He thought of Sarah again, her laughter, her gentle touch. But for the first time in years, the memory did not break him. It steadied him, because now, beside him, someone else carried the weight. They moved in rhythm, each task flowing into the next.
She braced the ladder while he reinforced the roof beams. He held the bucket while she poured water to soak the ground near the barn. Their silence was no longer distance, it was understanding. By late afternoon, the ranch had transformed. Windows barred, doors braced, trenches dug around the stable. The place no longer looked like a home, but a fortress carved out of wood and willpower. Daniel stood at the edge of the yard, staring out toward the open plains. His land had never looked so ready for war. Naya joined him, her spear tip pressed into the damp soil. She did not look at him, only at the horizon. "They will come when the sun rises," she said quietly. He nodded. "And we'll be ready." For a long moment they stood side by side in silence. The prairie wind tugged at their clothes, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. Daniel felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing at his shoulders, but this time he realized it was no longer his alone to bear. As the sun dipped low, casting the sky in hues of fire, Daniel tightened his grip on the Winchester. Tomorrow, blood would test this land. Tonight, he knew only one thing with certainty. He would not face it alone. Dawn broke red and violent, the horizon blazing as if the sky itself warned of blood to come. Daniel Carter stood on the porch, Winchester loaded, the stock pressed firm against his shoulder. His eyes never left the northern fence line. The sound came first. Hoofbeats, faint at first, then louder, rolling like thunder across the plain. Dust rose in a long line, growing darker as the riders drew near. This time there were 5, armed and ready. Daniel shifted his weight, jaw set. He had spent years waiting for silence, but now he waited for war. The riders slowed at the gate, their horses restless, snorting clouds of steam into the cool morning air. The leader, the same man from before, sneered as he pulled off his hat. His eyes glinted with malice. "One last chance, old man," he called out, voice carrying clear across the yard. "Hand her over, and you keep your life." Daniel lifted the rifle slightly, the barrel catching the morning light. His voice came low, steady as stone. "You set foot past that fence, and none of you leave whole." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. The riders shifted in their saddles, hands brushing the butts of their revolvers. Dust swirled at their boots, the only movement in the stillness. From the stable, Naya stepped forward. She stood beside Daniel, spear planted firm in the earth, her bare shoulders marked with old scars. She made no attempt to hide, no attempt to bow her head. Her gaze locked on the riders, unflinching. The leader's lip curled. "Then shoot if you've got the guts." The world held its breath. A single rifle crack split the silence. Daniel's shot struck the post inches from the leader's horse. The animal reared with a scream, nearly unseating its rider. Shouts erupted, and the moment broke like glass. The riders drew their guns, firing wildly. Daniel dropped behind the sandbags on the porch, returning fire with precision. Bullets slammed into wood, splinters flying. The air filled with smoke and the acrid sting of gunpowder. Naya moved like a shadow, spear in hand, darting to cover near the stable. Her dark eyes narrowed, watching for the first man reckless enough to cross the fence. The ranch, once only a quiet refuge, roared with violence. Dust swirled, bullets shrieked, and the morning sun blazed down on a battle that could not be undone. The fight had begun. Gunfire tore across the yard, each shot ringing against the wooden walls of the cabin. Daniel ducked behind the sandbags, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder with every round. He fired with calm precision, each squeeze of the trigger measured, controlled. Years of hunting deer across the mesas had trained his aim, but this was no hunt, this was survival.
One rider pressed too close, revolver raised. Daniel's bullet struck the man's arm, spinning him sideways in the saddle. The horse shrieked, bolting back toward the fence. The man clung on, swearing, before retreating into the haze of dust. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw movement. Naya. She had slipped along the stable wall, spear gripped tight in her hands. A rider spurred forward, breaking through the gate in a reckless charge. The man barely had time to level his pistol before Naya lunged, the spear's iron tip striking his thigh. He screamed, toppled from his saddle, and hit the dirt hard. The horse galloped off riderless into the prairie. Naya ripped the spear free, her breath ragged but steady. Her eyes blazed as she turned back toward the fight. Two more riders circled wide, firing from horseback. Bullets snapped against the cabin, one shattering a porch rail inches from Daniel's head. He ducked, reloaded, and fired back, forcing them to scatter. Smoke stung his eyes, but his grip never wavered. The leader pressed hardest, his revolver barking fire as he spurred his horse toward the porch. Daniel braced to fire. Then the wind shifted. A sudden gust howled across the plains, dragging with it a wall of dust. The sky darkened as grit filled the air, stinging eyes, choking breath. Horses reared and screamed, blinded by the storm. The riders cursed, pulling hard on their reins, firing blindly into the chaos. Daniel used the cover. He rose from behind the sandbags, firing 3 sharp shots into the swirling haze. One rider fell from his saddle. Another bolted into the storm, vanishing in the red cloud. Through the curtain of dust, Daniel glimpsed Naya. She moved low, her spear cutting through the murk like lightning. The leader turned toward her, his revolver lifting, but Daniel's shot rang first. The bullet splintered wood beside his head, forcing him back. Blinded and scattered, the riders broke. Shouts echoed as they pulled away, retreating into the storm. The hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the roar of the wind. And then, silence. Daniel lowered the Winchester, his chest heaving, ears ringing from the fury of gunfire. The dust began to settle, the storm already moving on. Across the yard, Naya stood with her spear grounded, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. She met his gaze, eyes fierce, alive. The ranch lay scarred, walls splintered, ground torn, but it still stood. So did they. The dust storm faded with the afternoon sun, leaving the ranch scarred and quiet. Smoke from gunpowder lingered in the air, sharp against the scent of wet earth. Daniel stood on the porch, rifle hanging loose in his hands. His ears still rang with echoes of gunfire, though the prairie itself had fallen into silence. The yard bore the marks of violence, splintered rails, churned mud, blood soaking into the dirt where one rider had fallen. But no bodies remained. The surviving outlaws had fled, their hoofbeats swallowed into the horizon. Naya stepped forward from the stable, spear still in hand. Her face was streaked with sweat and dust, her hair clinging to her temples. She paused at the center of the yard, scanning the field as though expecting another attack. Only when she met Daniel's eyes did her grip on the spear loosen. "It's over," Daniel said, though the words came out low, cautious, as if daring fate to prove him wrong. Naya nodded. For the first time since she had stumbled from the mesquite, her lips curved, not in triumph, but in the fragile shape of relief. Together they walked the yard, checking for signs of return. None came. The silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. It was the silence of survival. By late afternoon, Daniel fetched a box of nails and fresh rails from the barn. Naya followed with a bucket of water, setting it down beside him. Without a word, they began to work. The rhythm of hammer against wood echoed steady across the field. Daniel drove the first post, shoulders straining, while Naya held it firm. When his hand slipped from the sweat, she caught it, steadying the rail without hesitation. Her touch was brief, but certain. Together they mended the broken fence. The land demanded repair, and so did they.
Each strike of the hammer sealed more than wood. It sealed the unspoken vow between them. As the sun dipped low, spilling gold across the prairie, Daniel leaned against a newly set post. His shirt clung to him, soaked with labor, but his chest felt lighter than it had in years. He looked to his side, where Naya stood with her hand resting on the rail, eyes turned toward the horizon. "This ranch," she said softly, almost as if testing the words, "it's mine now, too." Daniel studied her, then gave a slow nod. "And you're not going anywhere." The wind swept gently through the tall grass, carrying with it no threat, no omen, only the simple song of evening. They sat together on the porch steps as dusk fell, the glow of the cabin fire spilling out behind them. Two figures, scarred but unbroken, bound now not by chance but by choice. For the first time in years, Daniel felt his land was no longer just something to defend. It had become a home. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. The next morning broke calm, the prairie washed clean by the storm and the violence it carried. The sky stretched wide and pale, as if trying to erase the memory of gunfire from its canvas. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester still slung at his shoulder, though for the first time in days his grip was loose. The yard lay quiet. Broken rails and churned mud still scarred the ground, but the threat had passed. Smoke no longer hung in the air. The silence that remained was heavy, yet it was no longer the silence of dread. It was survival's silence, the kind earned after blood had been spilled. Naya emerged from the stable, moving with a limp but upright, her spear resting against her shoulder. She had cleaned the weapon, its blade gleaming sharp in the morning light. Her face was drawn with fatigue, but her eyes carried the same fire that had carried her through the fight. Daniel met her gaze. No words were spoken, yet everything that needed saying was already there. They had stood together. They had not yielded. "Come," he said finally, motioning toward the pasture. The work began with quiet determination. Daniel fetched new rails from the barn, while Naya carried nails and tools. Together, they lifted, hammered, and secured the fence. The rhythm of the work felt different now, less a burden, more a vow. When Daniel's hand slipped from a nail and split open, Naya took it gently, binding it with a strip of cloth. The touch was firm, practical, but lingered just long enough to remind him he was no longer alone. By midday, the worst of the fence was repaired. They paused at the gate, leaning against the fresh posts, breathing hard. The cattle grazed peacefully nearby, as if unaware of the war that had shaken the land only hours before. Daniel's gaze swept the horizon. For years, he had seen this same stretch of prairie as a reminder of what he'd lost, his wife, his boy, the life that had slipped away with them. Today, standing beside Naya, he saw something else. Not emptiness, not regret, but the faint, fragile outline of a beginning. Naya broke the silence. "I buried my sister once," she said quietly. "The earth felt heavy that day, like it meant to swallow me too. I thought I would never breathe again. But now," she looked at him, her eyes steady, "now I think I was spared for this." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He looked down at the rough calluses on his hands, then at hers, scarred, strong, but unyielding. Different worlds, different griefs, yet both still here. His voice came low, almost a prayer. "Maybe the Lord gives us second chances in ways we don't understand." The wind stirred through the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and damp earth. For a long while they stood in that quiet, letting the land breathe with them. When the sun dipped low, Daniel brought out 2 tin mugs, filling them with fresh milk. He set one in front of Naya as she sat by the fire. She accepted it without words, their hands brushing briefly in the exchange. The flames crackled, shadows dancing across the porch. The land had bled, and so had they. But the firelight no longer flickered over two survivors clinging to solitude. It glowed upon two people who had chosen to endure together. Evening fell soft and golden across the prairie, the horizon glowing as if the land itself longed for rest. Daniel Carter sat on the porch steps, his elbows resting on his knees, the Winchester finally set aside. The rifle had been his only companion for years, but tonight it leaned forgotten against the wall. Naya moved about the yard, carrying a bucket of water to the pen where the cattle drank. Her limp remained, yet she walked with steadiness, her figure upright against the fading light. Daniel watched her in silence. For so long he had feared attachment, believing love only led to loss. But as he watched her now, he realized the greater loss would have been letting her walk away. When she returned, she settled beside him on the steps. They sat together in the warm glow of dusk, the silence no longer heavy but companionable. Crickets chirped in the tall grass, and the wind whispered through the posts of the newly mended fence. Daniel reached for the Bible resting on the porch rail. Its leather cover was worn, its pages yellowed with time. He opened it, not by habit, but by choice, and read softly into the quiet. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. 1 Corinthians 13:13. The words lingered in the air, carried by the wind across the prairie. Naya turned her head, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight spilling from the cabin. She did not speak, but her hand moved to rest gently over his, the gesture stronger than any reply. For a while they remained there, two scarred souls bound not by blood or history, but by choice, by faith, by love, by the simple fact that neither had turned away when it mattered most. Later, inside the cabin, the fire crackled bright. Daniel poured coffee into 2 mugs, setting one in front of her. She accepted it with a faint smile, the first he had seen without shadow since the day she arrived. It softened the scars on her face, turning them not into reminders of pain, but into marks of survival. Daniel leaned back, his gaze on the flames. "This house used to be filled with laughter. I thought those days were gone." He turned to her. "But tonight, it feels like a home again." Naya sipped from her cup, then set it down. "Home is not walls," she said simply. "It is the people who stand with you when the storms come." Her words settled deep in him. For years he had built walls, both of wood and of silence, believing they would shield him from hurt. Now he knew better. Home was not built of walls, but of trust, of hands that carried burdens together. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and untamed. Danger might return one day. Storms would rise again, but Daniel no longer felt he would face them alone. He reached for her hand. She let him take it, her grip strong, steady. They sat that way as night deepened, firelight painting the cabin walls, the land breathing quietly beyond. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter bowed his head, not in grief, but in gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for second chances, for the woman beside him. The wind carried the scent of sage and ash, and above them the stars began to burn through the dark. A new chapter had opened, written not in solitude, but in shared strength. In the harsh West, love did not arrive on easy paths or pretty promises. It came in scars, in burdens shared, in hands that still held tight after the storm. And in that, Daniel knew they had found not just survival, but salvation. Friends, when the fire burns low and the prairie wind carries only silence, it is easy to believe we walk this life alone. But as Daniel and Naya's journey reminds us, even in the harshest deserts of grief and danger, love and faith can still take root. Their scars did not make them weaker. They made them strong enough to hold on to each other. Perhaps you too carry memories of loss, of days when laughter filled a house that now stands quiet. Or maybe you know the weight of starting again when hope feels far away. Let this story whisper to your heart that second chances still come, and that the hand of God is never too far to guide us. If this tale stirred something within you, dear friends, subscribe and join me again. Together, we'll keep alive the spirit of true Wild West stories.